Thank you very much again, Jairus, for generosity in accepting this invitation. I hope we have some lively and dynamic conversation. I have a brief introductory note about you, and then I will move on to the question. So, and you can correct my introduction. So, so Jairus Victor Grove is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii. He finished his PhD in International Relations and Political Theory, Department of Political Science, Johns Hopkins University, and in 2011. His work has centered, according to his profile, on the ecology and future of global warfare, and he's interested in the ways war continues to expand, bringing an ever greater collection of participants and technologies into the gravitational pull of violent conflict. So, Savage Ecologies, I have the book here. So, Savage Ecologies, War and Geopolitics at the End of the War, was published in 2011, where you basically contend that we live in a world made by war. So, a common sense, primarily a common sense question, is this notion based on a different conception of war or a different understanding of the world?
I think that's a good question. I think a little bit of both. So I think the book was in some ways a response to the attempt to narrow the definition of war, which has been quite common in kind of contemporary social science, which wanted to see war as these very particular understandings of battle with a particular understanding of a number of deaths in a period of time. And this idea of a kind of temporally and geographically bounded war, to me, seemed not only not to capture the world, but to kind of belie a certain lie that we wanted to tell ourselves, right? Which was that war was declining, that we were seeing less war in the world. And to me, I think it was quite the opposite. We're seeing more war, but it resembles our sort of expectations of war less and less. So I wanted to say something about the changing nature of war and its distribution, but I also wanted to make a claim, which I think is also sometimes a bit counterintuitive to people, which is that war is fundamentally creative, that war is a kind of mutational creative force, which doesn't mean a good force, but it means one that will constantly defy our conceptual boundaries because of the ways in which it changes, evolves, breaks, and makes new things.
Yeah, thank you. And so I mean, through the international consensus, war is seen, as you said, as being on decline. I mean, the same applies to violence, not only to war. The same applies to violence in more general sense, like people like Steven Pinker, an evolutionary psychologist, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, argues that the problem of, I'm quoting him, violence can be solved by applying rational thought, end of quote, and the violence is declining. Yet the book, your book, reads as a speculative reflection of war and proposes a martial theory, which is neither critical nor ethical theory. First of all, I would be thankful if you explain what this martial theory is and how it cuts across both critical and positivist morality.
Thanks. That's a big question. I think by martial theory, I wanted to try to get away from this idea that everything was political theory, right? So politics tends to be the way that we create a center of gravity for all forms of philosophical thought or conceptual thought, which we think are relevant to the way that the world changes, right? Politics often sucks all the air out of the room. Whereas I think war has its own kinds of logics and procedures and movements and possibilities. And so I wanted to try to ask the questions, right? We have all of these sort of core reflections for what political theory is. It's about relationships between the state and human agency. It's about what constitutes democracy or what constitutes participation. But we don't have a similar set of well-defined concepts and terms for war, right? And I think in part that's because we like to believe that war is rare, is episodic, is a sort of exception right, to politics, or it's merely its tool or its means. And so I wanted to kind of reverse that presumption and say, well, what if war is actually a fundamentally formative character of the planet? And I think in part, that's why I wanted to look at such a long slice of time, right? Sort of from Columbus forward, this thinking that this era of settler colonialism that we live in, and this sort of expansionist imperialism that we live in, that kind of world making was one where politics was often late, right? It was a belated entrant that came much after the periods of war and settlement took place. And so I wanted to foreground that notion of war as a kind of making, as a kind of world making, and as a kind of form of life, and how we ended up with the kind of international system we have today. So, I mean, in part, this is the reason why I find claims by people like Pinker so absurd, because he says, "Oh, we see so much less violence in the world," and that's because he can basically not count, and I mean statistically not count, so many forms of slow violence, right? Whether or not it's the ways that pollution is distributed amongst particular communities of color rather than sort of equally, whether it's the fact that the United States relies so heavily on carceral violence, putting people in prisons and letting them either die or be abused or otherwise having violence taking place somehow under the jurisdiction of the state, or even the ways in which state violence gets outsourced to the numbers of militias that we have going on around the world, who often act in the name of certain kinds of fascist aesthetics, which we'd normally associate with the state, but seem to be able to organize kind of in parallel and exist in a sort of parasitic and often resonance relationship with other kinds of institutions. And so for me, martial theory is a way to try to get at that formative, distributive nature of violence without falling into the same old conceptual terrain that we have around the state and politics. And my hope is that when we start doing that, we realize, of course, the ways that we traditionally counted violence do seem to be on the decline. But the sort of joke I always make to my students is that looking at the Correlates of War project and seeing that there are fewer casualties of war, given the definitions of war that they use, is a bit like saying that there are fewer catapult deaths. It's true, we're not killing as many people with catapults, but it's certainly not the case that means that there isn't a kind of lethal world of violent organization. So I'm trying to get at this sort of mutational, changing character of the nature of violence, rather than knowing in advance what we're looking for.
Right, a short quote from you, like talking about climate and global warming, the hope that global warming could provide a universal ground for the for the cosmopolitan solidarity, as yet unachieved by other means, is dangerously naive and already often co-opted for cynical ends. Why, Jairus?
I'll give you a good example. Recently, there's all this excitement right now that in the United States, we may have actually been able to create a contained fusion reactor, which would create so-called limitless energy. Everyone's excited because it means, oh, great, we don't have to rely on oil, or, oh, great, that should drop the cost of power. And all I can think is all the ways in which that won't happen, right? I very much doubt that limitless electricity will change the interest in getting oil. I also don't think that limitless energy is going to drop people's electrical bills. What I think it will do is mean that one of the few limits we've had on development, which is the cost of energy, right, will just be let open, right? That it will be possible then to do more, build more, pave more, expand more. And so I think one of the major problems of seeing sort of CO2 as the source of the climate change problem is that it depoliticizes the very processes which, when confronted by the fact that CO2 was a climate change problem, that very few states cared. And when they cared, they tended to only care insofar it was in their own interests. And then think about also, think about all the supposed progressive responses to climate change, right? When we think about things like the so-called, Green New Deal, I can't help but listen, and sort of the back of my head, it's something that, you know, if anyone from the developing world had been in the room when they branded that idea, they would have said, Green New Deal, you know, we're living through the catastrophe of the Green Revolution. Are you sure you want to call it the Green New Deal? Because the fact is, the Green New Deal was a commitment to a new kind of extractivism. It was replacing oil with extracting things like lithium, right? Having to find ways to build enormous batteries, which meant taking vital resources, oftentimes from indigenous communities, blowing the tops off mountains. It also meant having to build new networks through neighborhoods, which may or may not want them built through. It also meant creating a tremendous amount of e-waste, which we still have found no way to deal with. And the reality is we don't bear the burden of things like discarded batteries or discarded chips equally, right? Those things go to places like Karachi and places throughout West Africa where that e-waste is dumped and fouls water and destroys communities and causes cancer. And so, you know, I think it's not that I want to be cynical of the possibility of something like global collective action. It's that within the sort of confines of power politics, crises like climate change don't produce cosmopolitanism. What they produce is the same states who are already setting the agenda, finding new ways to move violence around, right? New ways to distribute that violence so that they don't have to bear the costs of building more malls, you know, having more cheap labor, more skyscrapers, right? They get to put those costs onto other people. And for me, you know, I mean, I think a lot of Marxists would describe that as capitalism, but what I would say is that war is actually a fundamental part of that redistribution. It's not just the flows of capital that do it. It's the ability to compel people to be the bearers of our burdens. And I think that's part of a certain kind of Marshall logic, not just a capital logic.
All right, thank you. A lot of the world is already apocalyptical. Namely, this is not the first time, the first crisis, or even the first apocalypse. Yet, ironically, those who think that they are starting to feel crisis are the ones who ask the others for solidarity and unanimity. What makes it yet funnier is that this model functions both nationally and internationally. A political narcissism, I would say, which wants the whole world to be in solidarity with them just because we are beginning to feel affected by some crisis. As I said, one can even trace this self-absorption or this narcissism on a local and national level, which is a result of rejecting geopolitics through myopic lenses, let alone in the level of Eurocene, as you describe, or imperial, where hegemony asks for solidarity, as in terms of climate change. It seems that even there is a discourse of competitiveness rather than solidarity.
Yeah, it's a false kind of solidarity. It's a language of solidarity and expectation of unequal sacrifice. And I do think it comes from a narcissism, but sometimes I'm not even sure it's a narcissism. Sometimes I think it's just it's a kind of will to power, right? It's a pure expectation of who ought to bear burdens and who ought not to. And, you know, I think one of the things which I try to get to in the book a bit, particularly actually in the sort of early section, where I'm talking about this problem of the dehumanization thesis, is that, you know, we like to think that people have the best of intentions, and then sometimes there's something like a narcissism or ignorance or sort of misdirection or other things which cause otherwise good people to act in ways that are highly destructive. We tell ourselves those stories, even when we talk about racists or Nazis. We like to tell the story that, oh, they were only capable of that because of a process of dehumanization, which allowed them to see their victims as not human. And I think one of the things that I would want to say is that we ought to start taking seriously that those people knew exactly what they were doing, that they saw those who they were killing and murdering and excluding as people, and that had no effect upon them. And I think that's a more important proposition to take seriously, which is that humanity doesn't need to be degraded for humanity to be just profoundly and catastrophically violent and exploitative. And I think we have to stop telling ourselves this narrative that if humanity could only be restored, then somehow these things wouldn't be possible, right? And I think that's one of the sort of bedtime stories of human rights, right? That's one of the bedtime stories of cosmopolitanism, that if it weren't for our provincialisms, that maybe we wouldn't be able to do these things to one another. And, you know, watching, I don't know, the last several hundred years of history, it's remarkable to me that anyone can tell ourselves that story when, you know, oftentimes the worst things we do to those whom we most obviously find to be like us, right? So I think that's not to say that I don't think that racism is profoundly effective at organizing violence. It's that I don't think that racism relies on a sense of innate inferiority. I think it relies on a sense of compelled inferiority, meaning that violence is capable of causing people to have to accept an inferiority, and that people know exactly what they're doing when they do it. It's not people just being a bit confused or uninformed. Yeah.
Right. Well, a set of questions. I don't expect you to answer all of them.
Sure.
So power is much about control and plasticity than about violence. Does it mean that we have less violence and more control in the world? Is it fair to apply the distinction between sovereign and societies of control here? Do you think that the reason societies of control can work is actually the fact that the sovereign societies and their notorious violence is not yet completely obsolete? As an example, do you think that censorship, which is actually a very hot topic now in Iran, on the one hand, and bots and trolls on the other hand, actually feed each other and need each other?
No, I think they are exactly the way that Bill Conley describes the capitalist Christian resonance machine, where they seem to be opposed, right? This notion of Christianity seems to be at odds with a certain kind of logic of capitalism, but in fact, they thrive upon one another to produce something like evangelical right-wing politics. I think similarly, there's no way to separate the sort of floating logics and platforms of control and the sovereign desire to shift those in particular directions, to use censorship practices to incarcerate people, to target particular kinds of leaders or activists. I don't think these things are opposed. I do think that they proceed by different modes of reason, which is to say that I think in a strange way, censorship becomes a way of making people feel hyper visible, targeting them, giving the state a certain kind of raison d'etre to intervene in their lives in a way that is consonant with a discourse of authority and sometimes even a discourse of legitimacy. Where I think bots tend to work within an economy of desire. So the reason why bots are so effective is not because they brainwash us, but because they nudge us in, to invert, I suppose, Pinker's book title, towards the worst demons of our nature, right? They inflame those things which we suspect, but we're not quite willing to say out loud, and they give us the permission to do so. And so I think bots succeed and they succeed through experimentation, right? Most bots fail, but bots continually promote even stories sometimes that are true, or they push certain ideas or opinions to the top, right, of a circulation list, or they suggest other sort of persuasive or seductive things which can organize them. And then when they gel, when they become what Guattari called a collective logic of enunciation, right? Then that galvanizes something which really intensifies and accelerates people's behavior. And of course, then those things can resonate back and forth, sometimes antagonistically, sometimes I think synthetically, between sovereign modes of censorship. But they're neither intrinsically opposed nor sort of explicitly collaborative, but they they pulsate, right? They
Right.
find certain kinds of pulsing resonances.
Right.
And I think that's in part what makes it so dangerous, is that we are really lacking in a language to talk about that resonance, right? We know how to
Perfect.
talk about states, and we kind of know how to talk about propaganda, and we don't know how to talk about this machinic relationship, I think,
Right.
really at all.
Right. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So again, quoting you, Jairus, there is a centuries-long investment in research, development, and deployment of techniques to ensure that survival is only ever right for some. The right for some more than not, the right for some more often than not, more often than not, is ensured at the expense of the self-determination and continuing of living for the overwhelming majority of the planet's population, end of quote. So using form of life as a concept, you maintain that, again, quoting you, the geopolitical project of planet Earth is a violent pursuit of a form of life at the cost of others, full stop, end of quote. Isn't, in your idea, one reason deadly, perhaps it's also related to the last questions, one reason deadly and barbaric violence, for instance, in the Middle East, is constantly called attention to, is that this form of violence obscures the refurbished violence being programmed in the Eurocene?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I do think, and this is one of the reasons why I was trying to rework the concept of war, is that we find sort of spectacular forms of violence to be more violent in some sense. One of the things that I also always remind my students is how much more destructive sanctions were for Iraq even than the most sort of flagrant of US direct military action. What was remarkable about the ability to deprive people of life as a form of warfare was how much more supple it was at reaching, in some sense, everyone, right? Making sure that very basic needs couldn't be met by their own hands, right? Requiring that they not be able to have chlorine, for instance, so you couldn't clean water, right? To be able to literally target the metabolism, right? And the kind of microbiome of drinking water, right? Made for a level of catastrophe, which never made a good news story, right? And I think that's sort of similar too, where, we talk about the instability of a state, or we talk about uprisings. We talk about them in very particular places. And then other places seem to have a kind of Teflon coating. No one's talking about sending in election monitors to the United States, even though there's clear evidence, right, that there was an effort at a coup in our country, and that there was a clear effort of, trying to potentially rig an election, right? So we get to have the authority for fair elections in a way that other states are seen as being fundamentally illegitimate, or lacking the maturity to make those decisions for themselves. And so I do think we still have the sense, and this is not to underestimate the violence in the occupied territories or in Syria or what's going on in Iran right now. I'm not trying to equivocate forms of violence. I think what I would want to say is that the moral superiority that comes in many places in Europe and the United States for thinking that they've sort of outgrown the necessity, right, for breaking free of the political in favor of these sort of spurts of violence, which they see as necessary to overcome the limitations of what is and isn't possible, right? Those are no less, more or less present in Europe or the United States. They've just been, in almost a religious sense, transubstantiated, right, into other kinds of forms, right? And so there's different currencies and economies of violence. But I don't think that there is fundamentally less violence. I just think that those states have figured out how to partition it. And in some ways, almost in parallel to the technological investment in, more and more so-called accurate weapons or precision weapons. European and American violence has a kind of logic of precision, right? It makes sure that Black communities feel it the most in the Americas, that refugee communities feel it the most in Europe. And my guess would be that if you took any of those communities and you made them their own nation, then the Middle East would seem a lot less exceptional, much less Persia, much less, right, kind of the Central Asian states that the United States is sort of battered so much frequently. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how to classify those things. What I do know is to say that this idea that somehow the United States and Europe are the sort of settled states where war is no longer a fundamental feature of daily life, and the Middle East is a series of failed states. This is a myth, right? What we really mean is that the United States and Europe have found ways to redirect violence, and that the Middle East is constantly having to deal with having to unmake a certain kind of world which was imposed upon them. And yeah, it doesn't make people who use violence heroes, and it doesn't mean that people who refuse violence aren't villains. In fact, often those things can be true at the same time. And I think that's a real struggle, and it's one that defies the ways that the media requires a certain kind of narrative for stories to work.
Again, a short quote from you, Jairus. Each lost alliance of form of life means a future that can no longer come about. The geopolitical advance of homogenization is killing futures as it strangles the present, end of quote. Is this a favorable affirmative ethics for the future? I mean, basically the book, I would say, rather than a diseased and departed morality.
Yeah, I mean, I think the book has an ethos, even if it doesn't have an ethics. And I think that ethos is one which wants to see forms of creativity which are not thriving on forms of sadism, right? So it wants to see forms of creativity which are multiplicative towards difference, even potentially agonistic difference. I don't have a kind of aesthetics of pacification or a world where everyone gets along. Even a world, I'm not even sure I'm interested in a world without war. I think what I'm interested in is a world where the desire to extract pain doesn't become its own form of surplus value. And for me, that could still be in the sense that Bataille means it, or the ways that Eduardo Viveros de Castro has described, earlier forms of combat in Amazonia and other areas where it can be an economy of expenditure, right? There may be even profound agonisms that exist between each other, but that there is no desire to seek cruelty in those forms of conflict and division. And I think that's a difference. I think that's a possibility that the world has seen and sees all the time, right? Where agonism is not necessarily even looking for victory, right? And I think that's where things become really problematic, is when we think that we can use violence or we can use conflict in this sort of instrumental or strategic way. And then we disavow the fact that many of those seeking those strategies come to love, desire the forms of pain and suffering that those strategies produce. And so I think the book is not so much opposed to those, because I think those things oppose themselves quite well. But it's seeking other forms of life which would thrive beyond it, right? Like without it, right? Which would find other ways of modeling agonism and forming the worlds that don't require those tasks. So yeah, I don't think it's a morality. It's not a call of can't everyone just get along, or that everyone ought to be better, because I don't know that form of morality has ever changed anyone's desire or behavior. It's just an effort for me to try to actually stake out what inspires and drives me to keep thinking about the world, to affirm the world in its totality, even if I don't want it to go on the same way it has before. And I think maybe that's the little sort of Nietzschean tension, is that it's not an amor fati for the way the world is, it's an amor fati for becoming. And I hope that there are ways to intervene in becoming that alter where we go.
Right, great. let's talk briefly about horror.
Okay.
I just repeat your question, the question that's posed in the book. How do we think of horror as a genre of politics rather than as a cinematic or fictional construction?
Yeah. I mean, the shortest version of it is that I really want to get people to think about the political and war without a sense of providence. So one of the things that the genre of horror teaches us is that there is no net to catch us. There is no bottom, right, for which you can hit, which then, some Phoenix-like rebirth takes place. There may just be more falling, right? You just may keep falling. I've always been a bit inspired by the movies of John Carpenter, in part because they sort of, particularly things like The Thing, but even in The Mouth of Madness, they ask this question, which is maybe my very favorite one, The Prince of Darkness, in which the devil isn't some theological being. It's the fact that there may be, at a kind of quantum level, different kind of forces, some which are antagonistically anti-human, right, which are against the very project of our creativity and humanity, and that possibility means that there isn't a good in the world. There's something quite evil, and I'm not trying to posit a metaphysical evil. I'm instead trying to say, why do we proceed so frequently on the premise that we are owed a particular kind of future, that the future arcs towards justice, or that there is something for which things ought to be, and instead realize that, like ourselves, the world is fundamentally breakable, right? It can be broken. The world we thrive in is exactly what it is and no more. And I think there are no other genres, certainly not the tragic, which I think is also a kind of redemption in a weird way. I don't think there are other genres that capture that quite as well. But I think that's very important, in part because for me, even when I think of myself as very engaged politically, but I'm not engaged because I think I can win. I'm not engaged because I think if I can just marginalize the right number of people in the interim, it'll be okay, because for the sort of balance struggle doing, even if we fail, even if and for me, like, that opens us up to different kinds of political possibilities and ethical possibilities.
I don't hear you properly.
Sorry, yeah.
Do you hear me?
Oh, no.
I don't hear you anymore.
Hear you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Somehow not completely properly. Now it's getting better, I think.
Can you hear me now?
I do sort of hear you. Do you hear me? I think it's getting better.
I do. I hear you well.
You hear me? Okay, great. Okay, so I go to another question, Jairus.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, talking about like we have new forms of war, we have new forms of violence. Yeah. Can we also claim that we have new forms of poverty and new forms of impoverishment?
Yes. One of the things I say in the book is that one of the strangest sort of illogics of poverty now is how often it's about surplus, too much, right? Being flooded with too many calories in various places where you have access to all of the calories you need, but they have no nutritional value, right? You have all the sugar and starch you could possibly have, and it would make you potentially even harm your body from overconsumption. But that is the form of poverty, right? It's the substance of it, or that it's not that you don't have access to technology, but you actually have much too much of it, right? That poverty comes through a different kind of intensity rather than an intensity of deprivation. I don't think that's universally true. I mean, I do think that there are communities which fundamentally experience violence through their deprivation. But I think even in those cases, often it's deprivation with a surplus of something else, right? Because very few places lack abundance innately. Almost all places enact abundance because of what was taken away, right? So, and I do think that changes how we think of poverty, because it's not a matter of getting food aid to the right place, right? Or getting just that little bit of something they need, a little bit of temporary shelter, or a little bit of, protection. It's often about doing something and making a world that doesn't require the forms of dependency which have been manufactured for those places, right? Where they were dependent upon forms of crops which were not sustainable, or they were dependent upon forms of protection which they couldn't provide for themselves. And so, I don't know, I think it changes the entire logic of what we think of as the humanitarian, which is this sort of this idea of a gift, and sort of reverses the gaze on the humanitarians themselves, who often, what places need are for the humanitarians not to be demanding debt to be repaid that were odious debts to begin with, not to dump all of their garbage and toxic waste, right, on their communities, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think of a different economy of war. I think we also have a very different economy of poverty.
I mean, when it comes to even when it comes to these trolls and bots and fake news, I think that's also a new kind of poverty. I mean, you have all the resources, but they're not feeding you. I mean, there's misinformation there.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's a great comparison. They are the Twinkies of knowledge, right? The empty calories. There's a great line at the end of Pierre Hadot's Philosophy is the Way of Life. He says, knowledge commands you to know, but wisdom commands you to be differently. And his point is that there's nothing particularly good or useful about any knowledge beyond whether or not it's true or false. It's just knowledge, right? Wisdom is its capacity to have efficacy upon your life. And I think one of the major poverties of the contemporary era and of the internet as a kind of ideology is this idea that vast access to knowledge produces something like wisdom, right? As if there was a relationship of magnitude between data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And of course, what bots show us is there's an abyss, right? There's just there's a fundamental gap between knowing more things and having that shape who and what you are.
Right. That's why we need some sort of stoicism, probably.
Sure.
Right.
That's a whole other conversation, but I think a good one.
So there is another question. I start with a short but generous quote from your book, and that is, even critical and post-humanist approaches often lose sight of the role of hegemony and power. End of quote. So another problem with the Anthropocene is the anthro there, as if all humans equally participated in making this era, this crisis, and this catastrophe. And we all have the same responsibility now. Even Zizek might say the same thing. So this, as you say, patently absurd phenomena here is that we are all together radically, the radical equality is highlighted now only when it comes to catastrophes. I have the impression we need new words or new ways of naming them when it comes to justice. For instance, we need a word to describe this unfair equality, this imposed equality, this expected equality. Or should we talk of a kind of sacred ressentiment? I mean, as Jean Amery, the Austrian essayist, would say, in the midst of the world's silence, our ressentiment holds its finger raised. Is there any chance for becoming ressentiment, or is it completely tactless?
That's a beautiful question. I don't know. I would have to think about that a bit more, I think. for all of his faults, I've always liked Heidegger's sort of quip on resentment from What Is Called Thinking. He says it's the revulsion of will against time, a hatred of the it was. Which is, yeah, it's a recapitulation of the Will to Power notebooks. But I think one of the so I think sort of two things maybe that's maybe helpful, which is that any act of critique that thinks that it's about extirpating things has failed, right? If you think you can cast a thing out, right, then I think you're ultimately motivated by a certain kind of resentment, which means that I think every act of crisis, right, as critique has to be a kind of aesthesis, meaning a kind of working on the self. And that's not a reason to turn inward, because for me, what doubles the risk of turning inward to a kind of intersubjectivity is the group nature of ourselves, and the fact that intersubjectivity, a kind of radical interobjectivity, is the condition of our own introspection. And if we can do that, then we can bridge, I think, a certain kind of gap between this necessity to work on ourselves and this necessity to respond to the other, right? To not see them as wholly other, but actually to see them as a co-constitutive being with. And that, for me, is that's the torsion we have to hold on to, right? How do we work on this problem of resentment and not have it either turn into what I think a lot of people do who are critical Nietzscheans, which is to point out everybody else's resentment and not work on their own, nor think that to sort of turn inward and have a kind of aesthetic ideal is possible either, right? And I think finding that place where the subject shares its location of critique with others at the same time as it redoubles against itself, that's the best I think we can do. I think it's certainly it's where I find scholarship valuable. It's where I find thinking affirmative. But I don't think it's easy.
Great answer. A very short code and question from the book. What is the reservoir war draws upon? Surplus weapons, post-colonial injustice, nationalistic affect, or just rage can all be drawn into amplification?
Yeah. For me, this is the ambivalence of war. You know, somebody was asking me, well, you know, how do we get a world without war? This happened in class. It was the last day of class for the undergrads this semester. And my response, which I think surprised them, was, I'm not sure we're ready for a world without war. So there are times which war's reservoir is something which we would want to interrupt or short circuit, like white supremacy. But then there are other times when what war is mobilizing is precisely the fact that people want self-determination, that they want the capacity to make their own worlds and not have their worlds made for them. And so I don't think that there is a space where we could holistically say, well, now we're done with war. I've always liked this William James essay from the early 20th century, 1907, 1909, called A Moral Equivalent of War. And it was his critique of pacifists. And he said the problem with the pacifists who would like to make war against the law is that war isn't something that can be made illegal. War has to be something displaced by something at least as powerful as it is, as powerful at mobilizing us, as powerful at inspiring us, as powerful at generating innovation and creativity and collectivity. And so for me, I'm less interested when I talk about the reservoirs of war. I'm not trying to say that we should starve war out, but that war needs a competitor, something which can thrive on those reservoirs or mobilize those economies of desire elsewhere. To leave war without the capacity to find its nutritional supplement. And again, for me, that's very different than the Kellogg-Briand Pact saying it's an international crime to start a war only as a pretext for other states going to war against war. Right? For me, that's the kind of, the kind of morality that Nietzsche is talking about in the genealogy of morality, where it is only a pretext to a certain kind of suppressive violence, as opposed to thinking about war as something which could be again, left behind that could wither, right? Wither because something else is thriving upon the same things which drove it.
Right, great. Let's move to one of the nice enemies. In critical school. So I'm quoting a disappointment from Jane Bennett. I mean, Jane Bennett recalls her disappointment with Rancière. So quoting her, when asked in public whether he thought that an animal or a plant or a drug or a non-linguistic sound could disrupt the police order, Rancière said no. He did not want to expand the concept of the political that far. Non-humans do not qualify as participants in a demos. In a demos, the disruption effect must be accompanied by the desire to engage in reasoned discourse. Would be Jairus equally disappointed with his answer? Or?
I would be equally disappointed in any demos that couldn't be affected by other forms of being beyond those who seek linguistic reason, which is to say that I wouldn't want to be a part of any polis that couldn't hear those that can't speak. And I think that the problem that Rancière falls into is also a problem that disability studies would teach him quite a bit about his own failure if he took it seriously, which is that humans rarely can find their way into precisely the boundaries of linguistic reason, the way in which that kind of crypto-Habermasian streak in Rancière comes out, right? Instead, what I think we'd want is a polis so affectable that whale sounds, as well as those who could not speak, who were human animals, could bear upon our desires to engage in politics. So I'd want to turn the question around. I don't think it's just a question of expanding the political. It's the people who make up the political being not just human people. And that is the kind of work we have to do on ourselves, right? To make ourselves more affectable to more forms of claims, which are not always the claims that we expect to see in advance. And for me, that's a more fundamental disruption of the sensible than knowing in advance the boundaries of the sensible that can be disrupted.
So now talking about Rancière, let's have a bit of Zizek. And I quote Zizek, and I'm sorry to provoke you again. So quoting him, our survival is from June 2022. I think it was even in Berlin. So our survival depends on certain natural parameters, which we automatically take for granted. The lesson of the global warming is that the freedom of the humankind was possible only against the background of the stable natural parameters of the life on Earth, temperature, the composition of the air, sufficient water, and energy supply, etc. Humans can do what they want only insofar as they remain marginal enough so that they don't seriously perturb the parameters of life on Earth. There even Zizek goes, end of quote. Zizek goes further and even quote Thomas Metziger, where he says that it is not at all clear if the biological form of consciousness as so far brought about by evolution on our planet is a desirable form of experience, an actual good in itself, end of quote. I mean, do you think it is, is your understanding of it is quite similar probably to the way Habermas understands such perverse or pervert manipulations, let's say?
I don't know. Oh, sorry, I got disconnected for a second. I know, how do I respond to Zizek? I had a lovely reading group with him one time before I was in graduate school on Deleuze. And I was inspired by how bombastic he was, and also taken with how confident he could be of being misinformed. So, where to start? First, I would say that actually the creativity of humans was driven by disruption, right? Homo sapiens left Africa and hooked up with Neanderthals and Denovians precisely because of climatological crises. I don't think it's the case that our consciousness was driven by a relative stability. I think it was driven by an intimate and dynamic relationship with ecological change. And so on that front, trying to reground universality in a thumbnail sketch of evolutionary history that would make Steven Pinker even blush, I think is not a good way to start. The second part is a more interesting one, which is, I guess I agree with Metzinger at some level, which is there's nothing innately good about the kind of human consciousness that has emerged. It just is what it is. The question is what it will become. And I think that's one of the things that I try to grapple with in the Malibu chapter. And I find Malibu much more interesting on this point in morphing intelligence than I find Metzinger or Zizek, which is that the truth of plasticity is the truth of being able to self-steer and be steered at the same time, to live in between the fact that our habits retroactively change the next decision we make, but that every decision is automated by the decisions we've already made, right? That we live in that space. And of course, all of those are also collective, right? They don't happen within one brain. They happen in a network of brains, which aren't just human brains, right? And they aren't just brains as we understand them. There's a kind of what earlier philosophers called panpsychism, I would call transpsychism, which is variable levels and capacities of consciousness at different formations of collectivity, right? They're unequally distributed and they come together in unusual and heterogeneous ways. And good or bad, I mean, what a silly question. I think the question is, what can they do, right? To redouble Deleuze and Spinoza. What other kinds of connections could we build? And, fine, have your little antinatalist moment where you're like, maybe it would have been better if we didn't exist at all. But to me, that's just like, that's resentment with 1980s goth eyeliner. It's not, it's not cooler. Right. In fact, the real goth would say, yes, of course, this is all that we have and all that we've had. Now let's see what else we can do with it in the time we have left.
So Jairus, my last question.
Sure.
Thanks for your patience in the car. So that is, perhaps that is basically my unending obsession with the difference between power and violence. What is behind this question? But so in a refreshingly clever distinction imbued with an essentialist Heideggerian mood, a German-American philosopher, Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, makes a difference between cultures of meaning and cultures of presence. He contends that cultures of meaning are more dependent on time, whereas cultures of presence are more dependent on a space, and a space is their dominant aspect. Namely, it is through space that the relationship between human bodies is contained. So such normativity can result in crowds, according to him, blocking each other, and in turn, it can result in violence. On the other hand, for meaning cultures, or the cultures of meaning, he says that, I'm quoting him, it is typical and perhaps even obligatory to infinitely defer the moment of actual violence and to thus transform violence into power, which we can define as the potential of occupying or blocking spaces with bodies, end of quote. If I managed to present, hopefully, this little difference sufficiently, can this view take refuge in your theory of the Eurocene by claiming that Eurocene has been interpreting the space of the non-West, or even worse, that it is the power of the cultures of meaning, let's say Eurocene again, to observe the violence of others and hide their own power behind such observations or such sciences?
That's a fascinating question.
For the long question.
In it differently. Maybe I'll pose it with a third possibility. I'm part of a community here where I've watched people protect their mountain, Mauna Kea in Hawaii. protect it from being trashed by telescopes.
Wow.
And I would say that those communities of Kanakamali are not either just communities of meaning or communities of space, but that they make place, which is different than space, right, out of a kind of intergenerational and therefore intertemporal meaning making, which produces forms of power and counterpower, but ones which actually in their case refused violence as the sort of first measure, right? That found the ability to build a university, in fact, in the way of the police. I was profoundly taken by that. They built a library for the children that were part of the occupation. They built a university for those who were occupying. And their ideas, their seeking of knowledge, their seeking of wisdom, that is what interrupted the space for the police to deoccupy them. And so for me, that suggests that maybe that opposition between meaning making and space isn't something that can always be sustained, and may in fact be precisely a kind of Heideggerian obsession that the West inherits because we inherit all the wrong concepts. I think about the fights that Nishitani and Heidegger had between sort of Western nihilism and Zen Buddhism, and I wonder, in some sense, if not for a sense that the nothing, the void, was something which always had to be associated with anxiety, for which place always, a grounding always had to be a sense of respite. If that isn't precisely the problem with that distinction. And I would just want to say that, yes, I mean, I see your point, of course, about the way that the Euroscene enacts its violence through those forms of mediation and meaning making. But at the same time, I would hope those aren't the only two choices we have.
Right, right. Great. Thank you very much indeed, Jairus.